Hi there, this is another video looking at Joomla 4 topics, and in particular with reference to upgrading components to Joomla 4. In this video, it's the second video looking at the router, and in this video we're going to be looking at the build aspects of the router. In the previous video we looked at parse, and remember that parse was done once whenever it parsed the incoming URL. In this video we're going to look at build, and build is done repeatedly, and we're going to have a look at that just now. So building an SEF URL, this occurs whenever the root underscore function is called. So in our component it could be links on page or links passed to JavaScript. So for example, here's our messages page, so there's a number of links on this page, and it does send some stuff to JavaScript in some cases. Or it could be from modules elsewhere on the page which are building URLs related to our Hello World component. So it could be in menus, feeds, breadcrumbs, language switchers. So here's our menu. So some of these are Hello World related. Here's a feed that we introduced, and it's related also to Hello World. Our breadcrumbs up here has got sections in it which relate to Hello World, and also our language switcher where we're providing links to the associated records or associated menu items. So all of those which are related to Hello World component will cause the build to be called and our custom router to be invoked. So here's a few examples in this category template that we've just been looking at. Here is the URL which is used to output the link for a particular record. So that's outputting one of these records here. The Ajax helper, whenever we want to do the search results on a particular Hello World record, we send down a message which has got a URL in it, which is the Ajax, which is the URL to use for the Ajax request to do the search, and that's this one here. And then finally, if it's a menu item on here in one of the menus, then we're going to get a build required of just the index.php with the item ID, and the item ID is the ID of that menu item. So in terms of the work that has to be done, similar to the parse, we have to build it on an appropriate menu item. So the URL is built on one of the menu items in the system. So you have to first of all select the appropriate menu item if it's not already given by the item ID here. And the second thing is then generate the other segments from the remaining parameters. So the menu item selected will result in that menu item's alias being used as a segment, or in some cases it could be a chain of segments. And then the other parameters will create the other segments for the URL. The language parameter also gives the language segment, and internally, if you're doing any debugging, it's the URI class which is used by Joomla to manage the data associated with this routing process, both the parse and the build. And there are some key fields within this instance. The query is basically the string which is passed to the root underscore function. So it's this thing here. This string gets converted to an array of query parameters. So it'll set the option to come Hello World, the view to Hello World, the ID to the ID : alias, that sort of stuff. And then the path is the actual URL string which gets built, which contains the segments. And the process of building means that you're depleting these vars, this array of query parameters, and you're building up the path until you're basically got the complete path that you want to use. If we look at the overall architecture, well, it's similar to the parse. So you've got two stages. You've got the injecting of the rules, and then the second stage is processing the rules. So the injecting of the rules comes within the site router when it is instantiated in its constructor. It's going to inject these rules into the data which is held in the router class using this attach build rule function. And similarly, the language filter plugin, if your site is multi-language, whenever the on after initialize trigger is fired, then it's going to get the site router and inject those rules relating to the language, again using attach build rule. And then the rules are going to be processed whenever this function build is called, and it is going to go through these three phases of building the route: the pre-process, the main stage, and the post-process. And again, you can see functions which are related to that. I should say again that this is Joomla 4.3.1, and I did notice some changes from 4.2.9 in some of these router functions. So again, this isn't a complete list, and it still seems to be fairly volatile at this stage in version 4. Also, as an aside, notice that this ability to inject the rules means that this is very flexible, and you can actually write your own plugin. If you need something particular in the URL building and parsing, you can actually write your own plugin in the same way as the language filter plugin. And after initialize, get it to inject some rules, and then those rules in your plugin will be called just as part of this router processing of those rules. So if we look at some of them, build init just does some initial pre-processing. The language filter plugin handles the language code. Build component pre-process is the thing which does this first stage of finding the menu item. And basically all it does is call our component router pre-process. And then in the main stage we've got build SEF route, which calls our custom router build. So the pre-process will be creating the menu segments. The SEF route will be creating the segments from those other vars. This will be handling the language code, inserting the EN, and then at the end this build base will build the original base. So you can see there's the base of the Joomla instance, kind of down to here. This bit here in particular. EN is the language. Then you've got a segment from the menu item, and then you've got the IDs that are related to that. So it's all very similar to the parse stage. So let's look at the pre-process stage, and here as I mentioned, the whole purpose of the pre-process stage is to identify and set the menu item, which is the item ID. And here there are differences from Joomla 3. In Joomla 3, the menu item of the page was set by default. So if you're on this page, for example, and you're wanting to build up all of these, it was the case in Joomla 3 that if the item ID wasn't set, then it set the item ID of this particular page, this particular menu item, as the default. In Joomla 4 then, there is no default. So if you don't get an item ID explicitly set here in the root call, you're not going to get an item ID sent into this pre-process stage, which is actually better, because the problem with setting the default item ID was that for the language switcher, that item ID was going to be wrong, because the language switcher was going to switch to a different language, so it was necessarily going to have a different menu item to build the functionality or to build the URL on. So you needed to actually change it, and it's much better just having no default, and then you set it up by yourself. So as I said, Joomla just calls the component router pre-process, and it's important to note that there's no opportunity to change that item ID after the pre-process. So you can try changing it, but Joomla will basically just ignore it because it doesn't take account of that item ID after the pre-process stage. So let's have a look at the code. If we look at I'm looking at our traditional router here in our pre-process call. And here we are here. And basically it's just looking, is the item ID set? And if it's not set, then it just gets the items which are on the site, the menu items which are on the site, and just looks for a match with the view. So it checks the view, and it goes through them all, checking for items, menu items which have the same view. And if there's an exact match with the ID as well, then it takes that item, menu item by preference. So if there's a menu item on the page down here, say for example hello world came up, then it would take that as the preferred URL to build. Okay, if no item ID is set, then Joomla uses the /component/com xxx. So I'm going to demonstrate that. So I'm going to go into our extension class, and I can uncomment this line, which means that it's going to, when it calls create router to get the router, it's going to get our traditional router. So this is the live one. It's not in my development area, it's in the kind of like live site area. I'm just going to save that. I'm going to relaunch this. So you'll notice some of these will change. Okay, so previously they'd been output by the RouterView, which we're going to look at in a moment, but now they're actually put out by the traditional router. I'm then going to go into the, you see these are output based on message here. So I'm going to go into here, and I'm going to take these ones here and just unpublish those. And I'm going to relaunch this. And notice now the URLs have gone to this format where it's got component, hello world, and then all these other parameters. And the thing about this is that whenever you click on it, it hasn't found a suitable menu item associated with hello world to build this URL upon, and it is taken by default the home page. And this picture here is just output on the home page, and if you look at the breadcrumbs there, you'll see you are here, home. So it's actually built that on top of the home page, which means that all of the modules and the template associated with the home page is going to be used rather than, say, a particular menu item associated with the hello world records, hello world component. So if necessary, you can use hidden menu items to avoid that. So if we have even a hidden menu item, which is there, we'll actually publish that. And we'll refresh this page. And you see, even though it's a hidden menu item, it's still got the URLs built on top of it. And whenever we click it, we find that that picture isn't there. We find that we're on home/message rather than on the home page. So you can use hidden menu items to good effect in that way to avoid that case of where you're going through the slash component sort of mechanism. Okay, the next thing for menus, after the pre-process stage of your component router, Joomla will then merge in the associated vars. So remember I said that menu items will get this sort of structure here. And whenever they're initially set, when pre-process is actually running, the vars associated with this, which are in the URL, is just basically the item ID. But Joomla after that, I'm not really sure why, but Joomla merges in the associated vars from the menu items. So if we look at a menu item and we look at, say, hello world. So this is a menu item which just outputs hello world, and you could see the variables associated with it here: com hello world, view hello world, and ID is equal to 18. And after the pre-process stage of our component router, as I said, Joomla will merge these into the associated vars which are held in here. And I say I don't really know why, because you have to just take them out again, but maybe it's something to do with the RouterView would particularly want them in. But in Joomla 3, if we had removed them in the pre-process stage, then they wouldn't appear in the next stage. So this does seem to be a difference from Joomla 3 and something to be aware of. Language filter plugin then sets the language segment. So that's the pre-process stage. The next is the build stage, which handles the remaining vars in the URI class, the query parameters that we haven't looked at yet. And that's the ID and view and etc. And Joomla expects the component router to do this. So whenever it's calling this build the SEF route, it pretty much just calls our build function to sort that out. So the component router has got this function here, build query, and it gets past the query vars, and Joomla expects to get back the segments array and unset the query vars that are used. So we'll have a look at that in the code. This is our traditional router here, and if we look at build up here, notice first of all that we've got this ampersand here, so the changes that we make to query are going to be made to the query, the original query variable rather than a copy. So as we unset query items, then they actually get unset in the calling function here. And we've got a segments array here, and we're setting it blank initially, we're doing some checking, but as we go down we're looking to find the associated variables associated with the menu item, and if they match, for example the view, then we're going to set the segments. In the case of a category view, then we're going to set the segments to be the list of category segments, you know, down through the category tree. If it's a hello world record, then we're going to set it to be the set of category segments, and then add on the ID of the hello world record at the end, and then we're just going to return that segments. And you can see also various calls to unset the IDs, the cat IDs, and the views. Unset the views. And layout there, unset view. So in various cases we're unsetting those variables. For the other query vars, Joomla will unset the item ID, option and language vars for us. so we don't need to do anything with those. But any remaining vars are added to the URL as query parameters in the URL string. So for example, when we look at this feed over here, we can see that it's got our URL down here, and it's got the slash or format equals feed and something type equals RSS there. So those are vars that we haven't actually removed, haven't actually unset, and they will just be added as parameters, as query parameters to the URL. Okay, finally let's look at RouterView. RouterView was introduced in some of the 3.5, 3.6, maybe around about then, and it does make things easier, but let's have a look at it anyway. RouterView provides the pre-process build and parse functions. So what we're going to look at is our router here. Now this router here is based on RouterView, and so our router extends RouterView, and RouterView is in component RouterView. So we'll just have a quick look at it. In our libraries component RouterView, and if we look down here, here's our build function, here's our parse function, and here's our pre-process function. So if we're using the RouterView, then the RouterView class provides those pre-process build and parse functions. So we need to kind of configure it using kind of rules, and unfortunately there doesn't seem to be much documentation at all around how you should configure it. So it's just a matter of trying to look at something like COM content and trying to work out what's going on and trying to copy that. So here we have got our category view. So we've got three views in the Hello World component. We've got a category view, we've got Hello World view, and we've got a form view for the front end form. And we start with the category, and we just specify that it is one of our views, that it's keyed on ID, that it's nestable, and nestable means you can have a kind of like a series of segments as you go down through the category tree, and then we just register that view. Hello World, we're kind of doing a similar sort of thing. We're registering another view. We're using the ID there, and we're setting the parent to be the category when it's got an ID of cat ID. So it kind of gives a picture of a URL which consists of a number of segments which are the categories going down through the category tree, followed at the end by a Hello World record. And then the final one is just the form, which doesn't have any IDs, but we still need to include it here to get it all to work. So say it's a bit of trying guesswork and following other components within Joomla to try and get this right. Providing callbacks for the IDs and aliases. So for example, if we look at our traditional router and we're doing the build process, at various stages we want to get the segments, and we want to know what to set those segments to. And in this case, we're setting it to the path segments, so we're calling get category segments, so we're getting the segments associated with a route down through the category tree. And other cases, we're just setting it to the ID that is passed in, and that ID will be, well, for example, in here we're setting the ID to be the ID number, colon, and then the alias. So you'll see that here, that the ID is just the number, colon, and then the alias there. So we've kind of, in our build here, we've needed to say what those segments are. We need to say for the category and what the segment should be, and for the ID. And in the RouterView, we need to tell it. So we have functions get hello world segment, which is for the ID, and get category segment. So for the various views that we have, we need to tell the RouterView what should be the segment. And if you can imagine, the parse would be the same but opposite. So when it's got a segment, it needs to know what the ID should be for that segment when it's going the other way through the parse. So that's the second thing that we need to provide to the RouterView. And the third thing is attach the rules. Now these are different rules from these rules here, but they are related. There are three types of rules that the RouterView uses. Menu rules, and the menu rules just contains the preprocess function. So the purpose of the menu rules is to provide a preprocess function there. So it will look for the right ID of the menu item to build the route on. Then the standard rules and the no menu rules have got build and parse, and the standard rules provide the build and parse for the case where there's a menu item, and the no menu rules build and or provide the build and parse for the case where there's no menu item and you're using that /component /com hello world kind of URL, which, as I say, you want to try and avoid. So those are the three things and generally what you would do is you would just include those three rules. So should you use RouterView or should you use a traditional router? As I mentioned, the choice is up to you. RouterView will make your code simpler if you have a component which follows the COM content paradigm, which is basically you have got a series of categories going down and then IDs of records. And a lot of components will have that sort of structure, and indeed the Hello World record structure is similar to that. However, if you find that RouterView doesn't work, it's very hard to debug and you can't change the code anyway. So you may find you've got kind of like quite a serious problem there. So for example, I'm going to just get the live router from Hello World. So you might think that, for example, because our Hello World records are nestable, that we could have nestable here, and we could set that there. And then when we try to, sorry, I'll have to change the traditional router as well. I'll have to change this to use the RouterView, so I'll comment that line out as well. And then when I click on messages, you see it's just come up with messages here. So it's not actually found the Hello World records at all. If I go and fix that now so that I take that nestable out, it's back to normal and it's found the records okay. So you could find some problems in RouterView. I guess my instinct would be to try it out first of all, but if you're finding that it's not really working, just go back to the traditional router. It will also match on the category RouterView configuration. So if you're if you've got this as your first router view as a category, it's going to look for that first. So you'll notice that in these links here for messages, all of them are actually built on the messages, which is this menu item. Even though these have got a view of Hello World record rather than a category view, but they still work, because whenever you click them, it still shows that converts the view to the Hello World view, and that will be done in the parse. So the RouterView parse will take care of setting the right view, even though it's built on a menu item which is a category view. And finally, you can choose alias or ID plus alias as the segment, and you could also do this on Joomla 3, but either way you can select the ID or not. You can just have an alias. Parse for just an alias, however, will involve a database query, whether you're using the RouterView or the traditional router. Okay, that's about it for this video. Hope you found that useful. Bye.